We're on. You bet. It's a great privilege to be here today with some of our friends in Media Land. I know you'll have lots of good questions that may come as a result to me or some of our distinguished guests later, but we're going to call them forthwith here. Justin A. McCarthy is one of our distinguished guests today, Professor of History at the University of Louisville, Kentucky. He holds an honorary doctorate as well, several at that. His area of expertise is the histories of the late Ottoman Empire and the Balkans, and he's published some 11 books, most recently The Armenian Rebellion at Van, 2006. He's been recognized with the award for outstanding scholarship, research, and creative activities. We're pleased to have Justin here, as well as Bruce Fein. Bruce is a lawyer in the United States, and Bruce specializes in constitutional and international law and civil liberties. Under President Reagan, he was the general counsel. He served as associate deputy, Attorney General from 81 to 82, and also as General Counsel to the Federal Communications Commissions in the United States. Mr. Fein has written numerous articles in various publications, journals, and so on. Mr. Fein, or Bruce Fein, also commands expertise, particularly as it pertains to our time together today, in the four cornerstones of modern international human rights law, which are the Torture Victims Protection Act, the Alien Torts Claims Act, the Convention Against Torture, and the Genocide Convention. So he's well distinguished in those various areas and very knowledgeable. Mr. Fein has written extensively on the Genocide Convention and the distinction between genocide and crimes against humanity. So we're going to call our guests forward. I'm going to moderate where there media stepping in for questions later as well. But we'll let them carry it away in a somewhat conversational style to get at the issues World War I, being its the 100th anniversary, human suffering in Eastern Anatolia, and it will inevitably get into the whole issue and question of whether or not there was a Armenian genocide as alleged by some people and has been voted on in various places in the world. And we'll have some candid discussion in respect to that from some very scholarly and legal expert people here. So we'll have them come forward. I think Mr. Fein is going to actually go second. Bruce, you'll go first then, I guess. So Justin will come, and Bruce as well.
Thank you for the introduction. And what I'd like to do is sort of set the legal framework for Professor McCarthy, I think, to elaborate on the events of World War I, which I think is rather convincing in demonstrating that whatever else the horrors were, they did not amount to genocide by any fair-minded understanding of the definition. But I want to begin by first raising some questions about the way in which the issue of whether the events constituted an Armenian genocide is handled, as we understand a due process in the procedures by which we resort in order to determine whether a crime has been committed, and obviously genocide is a crime of crime. One of the things that's rather aberrational is that the issue before us has been characteristically handled by governments or by parliaments, that is, legislative bodies, who, under Anglo-American law stemming back to Magna Carta of 1215, have no jurisdiction to make adjudicatory decisions about guilt or innocence. No matter what the crime, whether it's against Saddam Hussein being tried in a judicial proceeding in Iraq or the Nazis tried at Nuremberg, the typical way, because we care about justice and fairness, the typical way in which an accusation is addressed is through the judicial process, where one, you have a defined crime and its elements. Secondly, you've given fair warning to the defendant about what the punishment could be. Third, there's an opportunity to cross-examine any accusatory evidence and present your own defense. And lastly, you have a right to an impartial judge. An impartial judge. And just think about how all of these precepts are violated by the idea that a government or a legislature would decide whether the events of 1915 were genocide. Surely the legislators of the government, not impartial, they're politicians. They're responding to their constituents or campaign contributions. So they're disqualified on the first hand of not being impartial adjudicators. Secondly, they don't have due process. These resolutions are voted upon or government policies made without fair notice to the accused, which in this case is the government of Turkey. And not only are they the accused, there are other what you might call collateral damage to these reckless accusations. For instance, the children of Turks living abroad oftentimes are harassed. They're treated as pariahs and told that their grandfathers or their ancestors were guilty of genocide. So you have that collateral damage done without any due process, where there's an opportunity before there's a judgment to argue against that particular verdict. And then we also have the problem of defining what is genocide. The typical decision makers in the electoral process have never read the Genocide Convention. They don't really know what they're adjudicating. And they certainly are not scholars like Justin McCarthy or others who could give a fair assessment of what facts transpired to determine whether or not they satisfied the Genocide Convention. And lastly, with regard to the procedure in general, we need to remember that the crime of genocide was not conceptualized until after World War II. It was a response to the Holocaust, 1946. We're talking about events that transpired in 1915, decades earlier. And going back again to Anglo-American jurisprudence of 1215 onward, we have a prohibition upon ex post facto laws. You can't make something that was legal at the time it occurred retroactively illegal and punish it. And that's clearly what's being happened when you try to apply a genocide convention ratified in 1946 to something that happened generations earlier. But those are just some of the procedural problems that I think attend to these resolutions and government policies that attempt to adjudicate whether these tragic events in World War I were genocide. And then lastly, as sort of an introduction, I think, that Justin can amplify quite thoroughly, the actual definition of genocide requires that the specific and only motivation for the killing or attempt to destroy in whole or in substantial part, a group, has to be because of that group's nationality, religion, ethnicity, or race. If it's not one of those four motivations, the wrongfulness is not genocide. And in fact, during the evolution of the Genocide Convention, there was a proposal to add political motivation as also qualifying as a genocidal motivation, and it was voted down. So what I think Professor McCarthy will be able to demonstrate is, given the history and the context of the Armenian treatment and efforts at nationalism in the 1800s, and the eruption of rebellion in World War I were about, they were politics, establishing an Armenian state. The Ottoman responded like any other state does for political reasons. When you have a civil war, you try to suppress the rebels. We did that in the United States when we had the Civil War between the Union Army and the Confederate Army. And that's a last point which I think discredits the argument that there was a genocide. However, I want to go back to the more fundamental point about due process. I don't believe that someone gets acquitted without a trial, just like they're not convicted without a trial. And one of the problems that this particular issue has confronted is a wholesale refusal of the proponents of the genocide theory to engage in a fair-minded debate in a forum where Professor McCarthy or myself or Gunter Louis or others would present one side, they present the other side to an impartial audience. The proponents don't want to debate. In fact, they argue that to participate in the debate is the 8th stage of genocide itself. Can you imagine that? Exercising free speech now becomes the crime of genocide, which I say is a very, very big albatross in trying to get a resolution of this matter that satisfies our standards of justice and fairness. And with that introduction, I think I'd like to have Professor McCarthy then stand and demonstrate, I think, the history of the revolt and the facts there that clearly militate against this particular characterization. Thanks.
Good afternoon. It's difficult to take a complicated history and put it into 10 quick minutes. So I'm just going to consider the basic issue of genocide. of whether the Ottomans actually committed a genocide against the Armenians. And it seems to me, as Bruce Fein has just indicated, that there are all sorts of legal reasons why this wasn't the case. There are all sorts of legal reasons why we can't bring up even the idea of genocide, because there was no such thing when the Ottomans did whatever they did in 1915. We can consider all that, but the fact of the matter is, when people say there was a genocide, what they're trying to do is bring into people's minds the idea of Adolf Hitler and what he did to the Jews. If you look at the definitions of genocide, whether they're the UN definitions or more reasonable definitions, there is no way possibly that the Turks could be considered to be guilty of genocide. We'll go into that in a minute. But it can't be done. But what can be done is an image can be put in the minds of people that says the Turks were genocidal maniacs the way that Hitler was. And that obviously is the intention of people. The intention of people to do that is to force governments, to force the Turks to do certain things. First of all, to pay reparations to Armenian groups. Since all the people that were involved in those days are dead, their reparations groups would have to be Armenian community groups, which would make a lot of money if that happened. Secondly, or I should say thirdly, because the first point is accepting that there was a genocide. Secondly, paying for all of it. And third, giving all the land of eastern Turkey to the Armenian Republic. This is the intention. Now, we say that's crazy. That's never going to happen. Turkey's not going to give away this land. But that doesn't mean the people doing it don't believe that they will. And it also doesn't mean that they can't pollute the minds of the world and have great political effect by doing it. For instance, keeping Turkey out of the European Union unless it admits that it killed Armenians, which is an intention. Well, all of these things are intentions. All of these things are the reason that these things are actually done, because you can't imagine otherwise that people would be spending millions and millions and millions of dollars having conferences and organizations, affecting politicians, having press conferences, that they would spend all of this money unless they thought they were getting something out of it. It's hard to believe that all of this would go on simply to make a historical point. If that's the case, then they should be willing to debate a historical point. They should be willing to get together historians who will argue that point. But that's not what they're willing to do, and that's because the intention is political, not scholarly. Now, the reason that I say that there was no Armenian genocide comes down to the fact that the Ottomans in World War I were fighting what, in retrospect, we would call a counterinsurgency effort. Now, counterinsurgency is something that has been studied quite a bit of late because of American, Canadian, and others' involvement in counterinsurgency battles in countries all over the world, in which insurgents have to be defeated in some way. And you got to keep in mind that one of the main ways that we have found to defeat insurgent guerrilla groups is by removing the guerrillas themselves and the local support for the guerrillas. Now, this was true with the British in Malaysia. It was true in Kenya. It was true in Palestine. It was true in Vietnam, where it didn't work terribly well, but it was tried. What you have to do is you have to make sure that the people that are attacking your country, that are attacking soldiers, that are attacking civilians, that they are stopped from doing so because of no local support. Now, this is the essence of counterespionage. This is the way it has to be done, and I recommend to anyone that they read the manuals of the armed forces on this, and they will tell you that. So, what happened in the Ottoman Empire? What happened in the Ottoman Empire was there were groups of Armenian revolutionaries. These Armenian revolutionaries came out of the stew, the tradition of Russian revolutionary activity. There's specifically a group called the Narodniks that believed in using assassination as their primary tool of guerrilla activity. Now, these groups developed in Russia by Russian Armenians, not by people in the Ottoman Empire. They went into the Ottoman Empire and they organized rebellions. The intent of these rebellions, the primary intent, was to kill Armenians. That seems strange. But the primary intent in the beginning was to first attack Muslims, to do things like fire into crowds on Friday. They were going to the public prayer, fire into marketplaces, burn buildings down, knowing that the Muslims in the area, the Kurds and the Turks, would react to this by attacking Armenians, and that ultimately more Armenians would be killed than Turks. The intention was to force the Europeans to intervene, to force the Europeans to take over. Now, they thought they could do this because it had indeed happened. It had happened from the 1820s on. It happened in Greece in the 1820s. It happened in various other areas, but very specifically in Bulgaria in 1878. Now, since this had been done, the Armenians figured that they could get the same thing. When I say the Armenians, I mean the revolutionaries. Most Armenians just wanted to be left alone, just like most Muslims. They didn't get involved in this, not in the beginning. So they thought they could get the Europeans in. Well, the Europeans weren't willing to do it. The Europeans were afraid of the Russians. They were afraid if they did things for the Armenians, the Russians would just take over more and more, and so they refused. That being the case, more calculated methods had to be adopted. These were adopted by a group called the Dashnak Party. And what they did was they prepared slowly but surely, prepared for an outbreak against the Ottoman government, especially during wartime. They smuggled tens of thousands of arms into the Ottoman Empire through very porous borders. They smuggled men in from Russia. They had organizational meetings all over. And while they kept on attacking, they basically bided their time. They never made a major attack until they could count on the Russians. When the Russians attacked the Ottoman Empire in the beginning of the First World War, these groups mounted major guerrilla campaigns, refused to serve in the military service, attacked Ottoman soldiers, both soldiers going to the front and especially soldiers, the wounded and the injured who were being taken away from the front, attacked supply columns, and very importantly, destroyed telegraph lines that were the lifeblood of the Ottoman army. They took over cities, including Shebin-Karahisar, Urfa, and especially the city of Van, the most important city in the southeastern part of Anatolia. They took over this city and they held it against their own government until an invading foreign government could come in and take it. Now, this was treason. It's plain and simple treason. And the Ottomans dealt with treason in the way any country would. If they found the specific people who were treasonous, they did hang some of them, unquestionably. But most of the time, they put counterinsurgency doctrine in. Now, when they did this, they said they had to remove from areas of danger the Armenians that were a threat, either because they were guerrillas or because they were supporting guerrillas. And so they intended to do this. And they were following a tradition that had been set primarily by the British and the Americans. Hardly anybody talks about this, but these indeed were done in South Africa by the British and in the Philippines by the Americans, the same general way of clearing a population that was done. These things are very seldom discussed. People act like the Turks are doing something that's strange. Actually, the Turks were acting according to traditional wisdom of the time. It also is implied and stated that the Turks killed all these Armenians, that the Turks took all the Armenians from the Ottoman Empire and moved them off to the Syrian desert. Well, none of those things are true. Most of the Armenians were not relocated. In the areas in which the Armenians were no threat at all, like the cities of Istanbul and Izmir and parts of Ottoman Europe, Armenians were not relocated at all. They weren't taken away because they weren't a threat. Now, this in itself proves that there wasn't any genocidal intent. You can't imagine that if you had in your hands, in your capital, the people that you hated and wanted to kill, you can't imagine that they would have all escaped. As I mentioned before today, one can't imagine that the Jews of Berlin escaped Hitler. But the Armenians of Istanbul didn't have any problem. Why? Because they weren't thought of as a threat. Even the ones that were thought of as a threat, that were sent away, they were sent down mostly to the areas that today are in Palestine, in Israel and Palestine, and the southern part of Syria. Some were sent over to the desert, but most not. The Ottomans did a lot of bad things, unquestionably. Many Ottoman soldiers robbed Armenians. Ottoman soldiers, I should say Ottoman gendarmes, policemen, robbed Armenians. Many Ottoman officials did bad things, stole Armenian goods. Many Kurdish tribes attacked and killed Armenians, unquestionably. It was wartime, and people in wartime did bad things. But the Ottomans tried and convicted officials, policemen, and others that attacked Armenians. Right? Hundreds, thousands, more than 1,000 of them were tried. 10% were hung for crimes against Armenians. No Armenian or Russian was ever tried. Who's committing genocide here? The Ottomans obviously not, because they punished those. You can't imagine Hitler punishing the guards at a concentration camp. No intention was made, no intention of genocide of any way among the Ottomans. This is proved, it's demonstrated. All you have to do is look at what genocide is really understood to be. In the recent decision of the UN Human Rights Court, you look and see, what is it you need to have genocide? The main thing is intent. You have to want to kill all the people. It's just that simple. You can't accuse someone of genocide unless it is proven that they intend to kill all the people. Well, in this case, it's the opposite. In this case, we can absolutely, definitely prove that they did not intend to kill all the people. And we can prove that while many millions of Muslims ended up dying, 1 million in the area taken over by the Armenians, for instance, we can also say that Armenians died in great number. It was a war. And in a war, people on both sides die. And that's what happened in the Ottoman Empire. And people that use the word genocide for political effect aren't helping history at all. In fact, they're muddying history. They're telling us falsehoods, or at least they're telling us history that avoids one side. Because anytime you take a war and you only count the death on one side, it seems like a genocide.
Okay, if you stay in hand here, Justin, and I'm going to have our lawyer friend Bruce up as well. But I wanted to ask the both of you, maybe start with asking this question to Bruce. As you know, Bruce, last year the European Court of Human Rights rendered a judgment stating that it's not hate speech to have a differing view from Armenian claims, and that to suppress a person from expressing those differing views is a violation of their freedom of expression rights. So with that reference to that judgment, what do you make of Armenian activists having tried to discourage you from speaking today, being here and speaking to our members of parliament, and also of those Armenian activists petitioning to stop you from lecturing at the University of Toronto tomorrow?
Well, it's unfortunate, I think, Maurice, Justin, and myself, that what you've described is not the first effort that Armenians have made to try to intimidate or terrify us, not just us, I think others who share a similar view, from voicing ideas in the marketplace of conversation and dialogue. You know, we need to understand that, you know, at one time, you know, men believed in witches and burned women. At one time, we believed in a geocentric theory of the universe, and those who promoted a heliocentric theory were either tortured or threatened with torture. We're never going to get at the truth unless we sit down as adults and patiently listen to all the facts and arguments and have an impartial decision maker. And to suggest that somehow you're promoting free speech by trying to silence your opponents really totally misapprehends what free speech is about.
Exactly. I'll just add to that my own personal experience as a member of parliament here when these motions were first debated in the parliament here. And at that point, I didn't ask for this fight or this cause célèbre or anything. I just basically stumbled into it because it was going to be voted on, and I think that a member of parliament has a right to do some basic research, so that's what I did. And at that point, I wasn't even sure whether it was an Armenian genocide or not, but at least I had enough questions. So when I cast my vote, I cast a dissenting vote. And at that point, when I was just even raising questions about this being a genocide or not, because I thought there was substantial grounds to question whether it was, I got all kinds of nasty hate mail from Armenian people. And most of the time, I think Armenians who take a different view also get ostracized from their communities. But some very nasty, vociferous, vicious stuff, as somebody sent off to the House of Common Security, because it was physical threats to me. If I would have responded to them, and here I am, an evangelical Christian. Some have accused me of siding with Muslims. Well, this is not a Christian-Muslim issue. It's pursuing the truth, and that was my intent. And but if I had written back in an email response to those, in quotes, Armenian Christians, I would have said, well, you are an oppositor and a fake, because the God that I serve, the Bible that I read and study and am devoted to, a Christian doesn't do those kind of things and threaten people like that and use that kind of nasty language. So that was my personal experience of Armenian activists in a very vociferous, violent way. So thereafter, our government did this partisan thing, probably to capture votes and all that kind of stuff attached. And I think it's a shame that in our parliament we actually passed that when, as you so rightly said, this is a legal kind of decision. It should be decided on a legal basis in a proper court of jurisdiction, and also based on the history. It's not a genocide. So as I step away after in my 19th year as a member of Parliament, I will have gone down on the record to say that it's not a genocide, but there's been some nasty exchanges and stuff leveled at me, not unlike you, and I'm sure you get it in spades from different places.
One of the things
defending truth.
That's a little discouraging is that you have actually some governments like France that make it a crime for someone like Justin to go visit and speak. Right. Bernard Lewis, a very famed historian at Princeton, was actually convicted of the crime of disputing the genocide, in part because, like Justin, he said, you know, this would be like in Hamburg and Berlin and Munich, no Jews died.
Should say,
we're going to give Justin
we say to them, we say to those who refuse to talk, the basic question: what are you afraid of? If you're so convinced that you have the truth on your side, then talk, then discuss, then debate. And you can't help but think that the reason that they won't debate and won't talk and won't discuss is simply that their interest is political. See, a scholar wants to find the truth, and so debates and argues and discusses. But someone who has a political, a nationalist motivation, he wants to win. And so he's going to do whatever he can to win. And that's something that as scholars we have to stand against, as we leave it to the politicians to fight the good fight.
And in summary and in closing, I just say I think our common pursuit of truth from a legal point of view, from a historical point of view, and my having read some of the good material that both you gentlemen have written, all a matter of getting at the truth here. It's not an issue of Christians versus Muslims or Turks against Armenians. It's getting at the issue of truth and to kind of get at and understand whether or not there was a genocide. And I think the conclusive evidence from a legal and historical point of view is that there was not, but quite willing to engage if people want to come forward with other evidence, facts, or whatever. So we're open to that kind of discussion. But looking forward to your further discussions in the country, University of Toronto. Carry on despite threats and those kind of things that come your way. But I've been there, done that as you have, and
Thank you.
Appreciate your pursuit of truth as well.
Thank you.
Take care.
Appreciate the invitation.